Hi, welcome to Cyber Risk Analysis. I'm Steve Packard, and I have over 20 years of experience in cybersecurity and related fields. I've also worked for some of the biggest companies in the world on their cybersecurity, and some of the smallest. I have a background that includes a BS in cybersecurity. I'm a certified information systems security professional, a certified information systems manager, and a certified cloud security professional. And right now, there are a lot of bozos out there telling you that they know cybersecurity, and that's why there's a lot of misleading and false information. But today, I'm going to start off by explaining exactly what cybersecurity is and how cybersecurity is achieved. You might think that it's a purely technical field and that all you really need is a degree in computer science. You might also think that it's a field of just hackers turned good. Neither of those are true. It's actually a risk management field. So let's kick this thing off and start the presentation on what exactly cybersecurity is and how cybersecurity works. So the big questions are, what is cybersecurity? What do cybersecurity professionals do? What skills do they need? And what are the functions of cybersecurity? Well, before we talk about cybersecurity, let's talk about its predecessor, and that's Infosec. Infosec, or information security, predates cybersecurity. It doesn't even really have a beginning to it. It's based on the idea that information is important in business, in warfare, in any other circumstance. Information is very important. If your information is not accurate, if your enemy is able to obtain it or modify it, well, that's no good at all. So Infosec includes such things as information classification, information warfare, intelligence, counterintelligence, data life cycles, confidentiality, and privacy. Things like ACP, attorney-client privilege, things like NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, these are all part of what Infosec is. And so as you can see, there's really nothing new about it. Everything from secure wax seals to posters like you see above from the Second World War, paper shredders, and information classification. These were things that we worried about all along. These were big concerns during the Manhattan Project. These were big concerns during the Cold War. What about cybersecurity? Well, cybersecurity draws a lot from Infosec, but the definition that you commonly see is the protection of computers, software, network systems, and data from criminal use or malicious attacks. That's an okay definition, but there's really a bit more to it than that, because cybersecurity also involves the resiliency of systems. Cybersecurity professionals are often worried about things like disaster preparedness and business continuity, making sure that the systems are reliable. But the word cyber comes from the word cybernetics, which first came out in 1948. It was a sci-fi term to describe an interconnected world. And the term started to be used a lot in the 1980s to refer to the internet, cyberspace. We've all heard that, cyber cafes. So cybersecurity is actually security for cyberspace. So it's security for digital and digital connected systems, and it also might be known as data protection or data risk. It has very blurred edges, and the reason for that is that we live in a society in which everything is connected and things all happen on the internet. We buy our things on the internet, we get our entertainment through the internet. We use smartphones for everything. So it becomes difficult sometimes to say what is a cyber risk and what isn't. For example, is all credit card fraud really a type of cybercrime? I don't know. Credit cards are processed online, credit cards are fully electronic, so you could make the case that it is. It is a mature field that draws from many other fields, though. It's been around for a while. It does have quite a history. You might say that the first cyber operation started in 1939. Now, there were code cracking and information gathering operations before that, but that's when Alan Turing started at Bletchley Park with the attempts to use computational systems to crack codes, and that was initially the Enigma code. Computational security goes all the way back to the 1940s. There were systems like Sig Sally was the first secure voice link that used digital technology to encrypt voice. Commercial cybersecurity started in the 1950s, and that's because banks were some of the first organizations to adopt mainframe computers. At the time, they still ran on vacuum tubes and later transistors, But because banks are always concerned about security, the first protocols for private sector cybersecurity started in the 1950s. And the first cybersecurity certification was the Certified Information Systems Auditor, which started in 1972. And that certification was created because of the need to make sure that transactions were secure. And by the 1970s, most transactions were being made electronically using mainframe computers. So the 1970s saw the first modern efforts at cybersecurity. These efforts had previously existed only really in the field of intelligence and the CIA, that kind of thing. But private sector cybersecurity, the modern efforts started in the 70s. That's also when a parallel field, which was the hacker community, grew in the 1970s and 80s. And that started with phreaking, which was attempts to break into the phone system. It was really done more for fun than anything else, and there weren't huge losses. The CISSP, the premier cybersecurity professional certification, goes back to 1994. And the first epidemic of cybersecurity problems was credit card fraud. Credit card fraud was absolutely rampant in the 1990s, and that's because it was relatively easy to intercept credit card numbers and charge up a storm, and credit card companies were losing billions of dollars. So the first loss control standard for cybersecurity was PCI DSS, and that was launched in 2004 by a consortium of charge card companies. In fact, PCI DSS stands for Payment Card Industry Digital Security Standard. There are two important things that you need to remember about cybersecurity and that are often forgotten. First, cybersecurity is security. It's important to remember this because security operates a little bit differently than other fields. In security, there's a lot of camaraderie and a lot of support between security professionals. It's very important that security professionals are vetted and properly certified. A lot of security professionals are used to losing a lot of privacy, having their own finances audited to make sure that they're not embezzling things. It's also a field where people are exposed to a lot of personal danger, and when you go into a security field, you're accepting the fact that there's a lot of liability there. The bad guys could target you. In cybersecurity, it's unlikely that you would be physically targeted, but with insider threats, that's entirely possible. So it's very important to remember that it is a security field, and that makes it a very collaborative field, a very supportive field, and a very important field for safety. Cybersecurity is also risk management. That's exactly what it is. It is ERM. And it's important to keep that in mind, too, because risk management has some special rules and challenges that apply to it. Companies really do need to go out of their way to make sure that risk management budgets are adequate, because there's often a lot of temptation to cut risk management budgets because they do not generate profits directly in and of themselves. Risk management can be something that's difficult to enforce. It can be something that people are kind of down on. In cybersecurity, the CIA Triad is a very important concept, and that is availability, confidentiality, and integrity. Now, this is basically, when you're thinking of data and IT systems, you're trying to protect these three things. And in different circumstances, there are different aspects of the CIA Triad that are important. For example, there are many circumstances where confidentiality doesn't matter, where it's fully publicly disclosed data, but it has to be available, and you can't have these systems go offline. In other circumstances, it may be top secret data that you don't need access to very often, but has to remain confidential. One of the only things that is almost always important is integrity, and that means that the data is trustworthy, it hasn't been modified. So confidentiality, availability, and integrity are really the three big things that we're trying to protect with cybersecurity. So what are the tasks of cybersecurity and what skills are required? Well, most cybersecurity jobs do not require all of the skills I'm going to list here. The only jobs that would require you to be well versed in all of these would be jobs like consultant or possibly CISO or manager or director of cybersecurity or cybersecurity researcher. The most important thing is that it is a risk management field, and the cybersecurity BS, for example, is not a modified CS degree. It is a modified risk management degree. So you need to know the terminology of risk management. You need to understand things like risk transfer, residual risk, how risk is described and expressed. You need to know how to assess risk, both quantitatively and qualitatively. Quantitative risk assessment is something that a lot of people find very challenging in cybersecurity, but in fact, it is a field that we can assess the risk quantitatively very, very precisely if we have enough data. We need to understand risk transfer and insurance. So insurance is a very important concept. You need to understand how actuarial calculations work, how insurance is sold. That is very important. But also risk transfer and indemnification through contracts and mutual aid agreements. You need to know the ERM concepts, how businesses deal with risk, how they budget it. And you need to know business continuity and contingency operations, the various methods of risk evaluation, things like Monte Carlo simulations, things like stakeholder interviews and tabletop exercises. Those are all very important things. You need to determine how you can figure out what the risk appetite of an organization is. But when it comes down to it, compliance enforcement is really, really what is important. Enforcing the compliance with good security standards. You also need to know how to do post-incident evaluation, sort of a post-mortem of how security incident went down and how it could be prevented. And funding and budgeting is always a very important concept in risk management, because risk management can't be overly obtrusive or overly expensive, because you have to remember, it's not the main business of most companies, with the exception of insurance companies. Corporate governance is absolutely critical. It is one of the most important skills and areas that you need to know if you're going to be a cybersecurity generalist, and it is something that cybersecurity professionals deal with all the time. You need to know how corporations are structured. You need to understand how there is the C-suite, there is the CEO, the CFO, the CSO, all of that. And you have to understand how boards of directors work, how shareholder advocacy works, and how corporations are structured with different hierarchies. And you need to know business psychology and market forces. Why do companies do certain things? Why do companies have motivations? Why market forces cause businesses to sometimes forget about risk management? Corporate governance and practices is very important. In fact, cybersecurity is really all about governance. So you need to know governance concepts, things like policies and procedures. You need to know corporate ethics. And you need to also understand high-level communications, because cybersecurity professionals will frequently be working directly with CISOs, with CEOs, and explaining things to boards. So you have to be very good at explaining things in manners that are easy to understand. Again, budgeting and financing from a corporate perspective, how your projects are budgeted, policies, procedures, authorization, who can do what, who can give you permission to do what. You need to understand change management. That is a very important part of any technology, is change management, because technology does not stay the same. Public auditing is an increasingly important part of cybersecurity, because risk reporting is now required by the SEC, and incidents also have to be reported to the SEC. So understanding the Securities Exchange Commission, understanding public auditing, risk reporting, this is all absolutely vital to high-level work in cybersecurity. Another important area is business relations and how businesses relate to each other, how companies work together, how agreements work, and who is responsible for what. You need to know contract law, and you need to know about SLAs. Those are service level agreements. And you have to understand what these obligations are, what happens if you can't meet them, what the consequences are. SOC reporting, SOC reports and SOC auditing, service organization control, is a very important part, and that's how service organizations are able to demonstrate to their clients that they do have the controls in place necessary to have the risk controlled properly. Risk indemnification, how contracts transfer risk, who is responsible for what. When something goes wrong with your data at a third party, whose fault is it, and who ends up having to pay the price to get that fixed? A very important portion of cybersecurity is vendor relationship management. Also client relationship management and customer relationship management. Managing third-party risks and understanding how that works and how third-party risk can be evaluated and controlled. There's also often disputes and conflict management that comes up. There's a lot of legal and regulatory requirements. There are privacy and confidentiality laws, and these are being passed constantly. They're being updated all the time, and case law is changing all the time too. You need to understand how data breaches are reported. If there's a data breach, chances are you're going to be required to report it to the Attorney General in the state that you're in, and you're probably also going to need to report it to the SEC if you are a publicly traded company. There's also times that it may be required to report it to law enforcement. So you need to understand how that works. You need to understand the jurisdictional requirements and the civil actions and the torts that can result from this. You need to understand the standards that are maintained for different sectors and the compliance management. And there are a lot of important standards. In the United States, there are state laws, and so you may end up having to deal with the state laws in both the state that you're located in and in states where your customers and clients are located in, or states where you otherwise have a footprint into them. GLBA, that's a law that applies to financial institutions. There's HIPAA, that's the law that governs privacy and data security in healthcare situations, and not just healthcare situations, but health data like you might have in your employee HR files for their health insurance. FERPA is the Federal Education Protection Act. And then there's GDPR. GDPR is the Global Data Protection Regulation, and it is a European standard, but in general, everybody has to follow it because they're very aggressive in the EU about going after companies that might be located elsewhere but do some sort of business in the EU or with EU citizens. And so GDPR is also the kind of baseline that a lot of other standards are based on. There's also Sarbanes-Oxley, or SOX, which has data retention standards and risk management standards. So those are very important laws. There are also important standards like NIST 800, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. That is their framework for risk management in federal information systems. There's also the Cybersecurity Framework, which is a related portion of the NIST regulations. There's ISO, International Standards Organization. They have standards that have to be followed. By the way, these are not laws. NIST 800 and NIST CSF are required for federal contractors, and many organizations use them as a way of validating their cyber risks. But these are not laws, these are standards, as is ISO, the International Standard Organization. And PCI DSS is a voluntary standard which is enforced by charge card companies. They say it's voluntary, but if you want to do business with charge cards, it's really not. You do have to follow these standards. And then COSO and COBIT are frameworks for reporting, and these are also standards that help you maintain good cyber risk management. Privacy is a very important part of cybersecurity. Now, privacy is kind of a different field than cybersecurity, but they intersect a great deal because cybersecurity often exists for the purposes of protecting privacy, and privacy comes up very frequently in cybersecurity. Privacy professionals need to know a great deal about security, and security professionals need to know a great deal about privacy. So there's privacy law, and then there's the governance and ethics, because even if it's not illegal, you don't want to do anything that's unethical with the private data that you're entrusted with. You need to know about data exchange and data brokers. Data is very, very valuable to marketers and to researchers, and that's all well and good as long as you're doing it within the bounds of the law. You need to know data keeping and best practices. How can you catalog your data? How do you control your access to it? How do you make sure that you avoid things like insider snooping? You need to know about data lifecycle and data destruction, because there are times when data has to be destroyed. For example, when somebody has given you data and they rescind their permission. You need to know about the common mistakes that are made. One of the most common mistakes is that website trackers, which report back data on who visits websites to analytics companies like Google, are sometimes placed on medical websites, and that's not a good idea because that can end up leaking data. You need to know about logging and monitoring of who is getting at that private data to make sure that it is remaining private. There's anonymization and masking, but you need to know the limits of that. And there is data preserving technologies, and you also should know about biometrics. Biometrics is a way of securing systems, but there are concerns with that, like how biometrics could be used to track people's movements and how biometric data could be used to glean other information about individuals. So privacy is a very important thing that cybersecurity professionals need to be concerned with. There's also enforcement and evaluation. When it comes down to it, cybersecurity is really all about enforcement of standards. It's all about compliance. And the way that that is done is with auditing. There's risk audits, there's compliance audits, and auditing is done ideally by CISAs, Certified Information Systems Auditors. The auditing of cybersecurity works like pretty much any other compliance auditing. There's things like stakeholder interviews, asset inventories, control evaluations. So you need to know that, and you need to know how to evaluate risk. It's very important that you know workplace psychology in a pragmatic way. And that takes a lot of experience to understand where corners get cut and why they get cut, where there are common mistakes, how you can get people to follow the rules, and how to make it easy on workers, because really that is a very important part of it. The technology will not operate properly if the operators are not operating it properly. So training and awareness is very important. You need to know how to train people in ways that is simple and understandable, and above all else, not a monotonous chore. Now here's a quick insider tip. If you want to make training something that people aren't going to roll their eyes and groan about, just cater it. When you have a training session that is well catered, everybody's happy. But you need to know about that, and you need to know about the administration of technical controls. You need to know about the standards and practices, both the de jure and the de facto ones, how things are done, the roles and responsibilities, change management, asset inventories, vulnerability monitoring. Penetration testing is part of cybersecurity, and it is a way that systems are evaluated. It is the highest level of evaluation, is to attempt to hack the system yourself. Now, of course, this is something that has to be done within certain bounds. You have to have agreements, ethics, and you need to know the legality of it. Never pen test a system that you don't have permission to pen test, of course. But there's open source intelligence gathering. You need to know how scams and social engineering work, how to trick people. Trickery is a big part of why cybersecurity incidents happen. There are common technical weaknesses that you should be aware of. Wireless pen testing is its own specialty. There's also specialty pen testing, like pen testing IoT devices, vehicles, hardware, certain systems that are unique and require their own expertise. There's physical pen testing, which is an important type of pen testing where you evaluate whether or not an actual location can be broken into, because in many cases, the best cyber defenses in the world can be breached if you can walk in and walk away with somebody's laptop. So that's actually something that is a very important part of cybersecurity testing. It's also a lot of fun. And there is, of course, reverse engineering. That's another part of it, is understanding the technology through threat intelligence is very important. You need to know who you're up against, what the types of threats are. And these include insider threats. These include things like advanced persistent threats, foreign intelligence agencies, ransomware gangs. Who are they? How do they operate? What are the trends? Are they trying new things? You need to know the sources of open source intelligence, the various organizations and agencies out there that publish information on what's going on. And you also need to know how to model these threats, how to understand these threats. The threat economics are very important, understanding why they go after certain organizations and what they're trying to do and what the countermeasures are. And then there are offensive security operations. Offensive security is a somewhat controversial topic. It includes trying to hack the hacker's back, and under most circumstances, that's not something that private organizations do, although there are certain limited circumstances where that is permissible. It is something that generally has to be done in coordination with law enforcement. And then there is physical and conventional security, which I mentioned earlier. It's very important to understand physical and conventional security because it is more and more being integrated with cyber systems. One thing that is very important to understand is that security starts in the HR department. You really do have to worry about the integrity of the people you're working with, insider threats, hostile terminations. You need to understand locks, alarm systems, and how facilities are managed. Increasingly, these are connected systems with badges and key cards, and you need to understand how to evaluate the security of locations. Does it have adequate lighting, guarding? Are there good security systems? Are the locks adequate? And what are the best practices? It's also important to know about resilience and backup systems. Things like fire suppression and natural hazards. Remember, cybersecurity is all about keeping your IT systems and your data safe. So that means that we also have to worry about things like your physical internet connection, your backup generators, whether or not you have alternate locations you can go to, whether or not the fire suppression in your data center is adequate. These are all important considerations in cybersecurity. There are, however, some technical skills. I have made the point that it is not an entirely technical area, but there are some very important technical skills. For one thing, you really do need a broad and diverse knowledge of the technology out there because there's all kinds of things. One thing that's said is that cybersecurity knowledge often seems an inch deep and a mile wide. But what you really do need to know is network infrastructure and network and systems administration, how systems are administrated, how we control who is allowed onto what systems, how we deploy software, and you need to know about how software and operating systems work. And then there is cloud security. Cloud security used to kind of be considered its own area, but these days almost everybody uses cloud technology. And in fact, it's different from one cloud provider to another. You need to know about security software. There is special software that exists primarily for cybersecurity. Products like CrowdStrike and Tanium and things like antivirus, things like software firewalls. These are all very important. It's very important that you know technology deployment and the integration of technology. It's also important to understand patch management and version control. What about programming and coding? Is that important? Believe it or not, in most cybersecurity roles, it's not. It's always nice to know, and it can be very useful in giving you context. And there are certainly some cybersecurity roles that are programming intensive, but being a master programmer and a master coder is not always something that is all that important in cybersecurity. And in fact, you can get by in a lot of cybersecurity roles without knowing any programming at all. Some important technologies that you need to know are the Windows and Microsoft ecosystem because that's what everybody uses. There's a technology called Active Directory that Microsoft has put out there, and that's used to manage IT systems. You also need to know Linux and Unix systems because those systems are very important and very commonly used in infrastructure. You should know networking and wireless security. Remote access, that's very important. Remote access like VPNs, like remote desktops, how that is secured. And then security appliances like firewalls, intrusion prevention systems, intrusion detection systems, and endpoint protection. Load balancing and failover is very important, and as is knowing encryption and PKI, which is public key encryption. You need to know data storage, how things are stored on disks and flash drives and in the cloud, so that you can be sure that they're securely deleted, that they can't be accessed by people who might remove the drive, how it can be recovered in a forensics circumstance. So data storage is very important. And security standards, the things like secure DNS, types of VPNs. These are all various secure networking standards, and you really do need to be familiar with all of these to be a cybersecurity generalist. There's also incident response. When something goes wrong, you have to understand the crisis management aspects of it, the legal requirements and incident reporting, the cleanup and restoration. How can you get things back as quickly as possible, but without damaging necessary evidence? So you need to know investigation and rules of evidence, data forensics, cloud forensics, forensic accounting, event reconstruction, And this, again, is where business continuity and contingency operations come into play. There's also e-discovery, which isn't always an incident-related thing. It could just be that you're being sued for something or that you're suing somebody. But e-discovery is very important. And you need to know how to plan for these incidents. So incident response planning, tabletop exercises, full-on war games, all very important parts of cybersecurity. Secure system development cycle, or the secure software development cycle. Of course, not always software, but it's very important to understand how these systems are developed and what it means to have a secure software and secure systems development cycle, the best practices. You know programming languages and interfaces to some degree if you're going to be working in this area, because different programming languages have different weaknesses and different potentials for errors. It's important to know the development methodologies. There are different ways in which development projects are managed. You need to know the roles and responsibilities, the developers, the programmers, the managers. You need to understand software hardening, how it's tested and evaluated, what the standards and practices are, what life cycle management of secure systems are, when it's time to retire them. You also need to know API security. That's application program interface, and that's very important. That's how different types of software talk to each other. Data keeping and integrity. You also need to know about how third-party and open source code works, because open source has advantages and disadvantages to it. It has the advantage that it can be examined in full, but it has the disadvantage that it's possible that somebody could put malicious code into open source systems, and it may just be very well hidden and nobody notices it. The other thing is that open source doesn't always have anyone available to keep it up to date in it, but it's also very heavily used. So all of these things are very important to understand in secure systems development. Cloud security, that is its own area, but it is rapidly becoming a major part, in fact, it already is, of how we do things in the IT world in cybersecurity. So you need to know the cloud providers. The big three are AWS, Microsoft, and Google, and they're all a little bit different in how they do things. Containerization and cloud architecture, that's very important. You need to understand cloud deployment models, software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service. And you need to know cloud reliability, why there are multiple zones, why it's important to host your cloud infrastructure in different places. You don't just want one data center. You may want it in different areas. There are multi-cloud solutions where you're using multiple providers in order to provide that much more resilience. You also need to understand the shared responsibility model, where the cloud service provider is responsible for certain aspects of security, and you're responsible for certain aspects of security. You need to understand cloud and on-prem hybrid systems that work both on your location and in the cloud. And failover, if you lose your internet connection, do you have the on-prem capability to continue doing business? Cloud access control, identity and access management, how we know that we're only allowing the proper people into our cloud systems, and the available cloud security services that are out there and how to use them. For example, with AWS, there's a whole host of security services out there. There's Guard Duty and Trusted Advisor and Amazon Inspector. There are all kinds of compliance monitoring. With Microsoft Azure, there is Microsoft Information Protection. So there's a lot out there. There are some important roles in cybersecurity, and here are some of the most important ones. IAM, in identity and access management, is really the cornerstone of cybersecurity. That's how we identify who is and is not allowed to get into a system, validate that. So that includes things like passwords and MFA and authorization. It also includes role-based access control, making sure that people don't have access to things that they don't need for their job. There's incident response. There's security operation centers. SOC analysts are some of the most important people in cybersecurity. A security operations center is like a mission control for your security, where they monitor security continuously and respond to it. DLP is data leak prevention. That's another important area. Secure systems development I talked about. Auditing and evaluation. Education, training, and awareness, threat intelligence, patch management is a vital function of cybersecurity, and that is just keeping everything up to date. There's also firewall and network administration. Now remember, cybersecurity is not just IT, but there is a lot of crossover, and the administration of IT systems is where we see that crossover the most. And so that, in a nutshell, is what cybersecurity is all about. It is not just a technical pursuit. It is fundamentally a risk management pursuit. And as I said, very few roles would require you to know everything that I just listed. But these are the roles, the responsibilities, the skills, and this is basically how cybersecurity works. It is a field that involves a great deal of auditing, a great deal of enforcement, evaluation, of risk management, of corporate communications and governance, and also, of course, technology. It's also a very exciting field. It's a fun field to be in, at least for those of us who like it. But don't be intimidated by the fact that there is so much to it, because not all roles require that you know all of these things. Most don't. And it's not actually as hard to get started in it as you might think. Once you start to get a feel for it, it all really does come pretty naturally. And like I said, if you got a knack for it, it's just plain fun. So that's the first episode of Cyber Risk Analysis, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks, and have a great day.